I don't know if it is good morning or near of the good afternoon for all of us, but thank you for coming here. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the next speaker, but before to do that, I would like to give some ideas about the context of this kind of project, okay? The first one is that all of you has been heard during this morning about how our world is evolving, undergoing to a massive digital transformation. Many of the trends, technology that we have now are changing the way in which we are developing the new solution with our customer. Some of these trends, like big data, IoT, are enabled some initiative and outcome like smart cities or smart grid. But really, what is the motor of this change are the data. The data are very important and allow us to know, to understand what is happening, how we can obtain more benefit to our business, and even to give better services to our citizens. Most of these data are spatial data. And in this case, Esri is the company that enables the science of where. Most of the data that we manage have a location. And Esri had an experience for more than 50 years developing technology, spatial technology, to work with this data, to explore the data, to analyze, to enrich, and to understand better our business and our services to the citizens. And in our experience, like Esri, we have seen a pattern, an adoption pattern that is repeated in each of our customers in order to evolve and in order to do this kind of change, this digital transformation change. And this pattern are first setting up centralize all the data and open the data and share inside of the organization. The next step is once that the data are centralized and open, the next step is the capacity to analyze and explore this data and to share internally. And finally, is to put all the tools in order to push the collaboration, not only inside of the organization, even outside it, with outsider, okay? Today, here we are an example of this kind of implementation pattern that is Los Angeles City Halls. And it's a pleasure to introduce Lilian. Lilian Coral is the Chief Data Office for the City of Los Angeles, working with the Office of Mayor Eric Garcetti, and his role, she has taken the Mayor Directive on open data. Lilian?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Good? Okay. There's a lot of noise everywhere, so here we go. So good afternoon. My name is Lilian Coral. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles. In my role, I work under the capacity of the Office of Mayor Eric Garcetti. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today is really our vision of transforming Los Angeles through data into the digital city of the future, which is really our goal, and I think what everybody's sort of striving to be and what we're all looking forward to. So first of all, I guess I'm curious how many people are here from cities or public sector government, just so I understand the audience. Okay, one or two. And then private sector? Is everybody else in the private sector? Okay. So I think this is an interesting story because what cities are going through is not very different than what private sector organizations are going through. Essentially, we are massive organizations trying to figure out how do we organize our information and our data in a way so that we can actually leverage it, not just to do benchmarking and to understand how we're performing as a business or as a city, but also to really figure out how we can build applications and digital services that enhance the consumer experience, the resident experience, whatever it may be. So what I find is that the city's experience, although we are a government, is actually not that different than what major corporations are going through, and that we're all in a learning process and a learning sprint where we're trying to figure out how to best do this given the complexity of our organizations, the culture of the organizations that we work in. So as the Chief Data Officer of the City of Los Angeles, one of the big things that I focus on is really being able to provide my boss, the mayor, information in real time about how the city is performing or how the city could or should perform. And that means that I have to think about all of the information across the city's 41 departments, 40,000 employees collecting information, processing information, and think about how do we organize it in a way that brings the information into some meaningful life that we can then make decisions around at our level. Okay. So what's important to think about is the context of the city as infrastructure that's already in place upon which we have to build this digital city. So we don't have the luxury of building a city or a smart city from scratch, right? We have this built environment. And so now to digitize that environment, one of the biggest considerations, right, is something like density. So Los Angeles is one of the most dense cities. We are 4 million residents in the city of Los Angeles in 469 square miles. And there's 11 million residents in the greater Los Angeles area. We have nearly 50 million visitors a year, over 100,000 businesses in the city alone. We speak 185 different languages in the city of Los Angeles. So the diversity of the city, the size of the city is really important. We're also a very decentralized government. And then I love to put into context, you know, we have 6,000 miles of sewer, 22,000 miles of street, 2 million Google Waze sensors, which are individuals driving around the city with their mobile phones. So a lot of my work isn't just about organizing the information within our 41 departments. It's about figuring out how that information connects with all of this infrastructure and all of these sensors into something that's meaningful that tells us, you know, how are we doing on a day-to-day. So the big piece or the big key to digital transformation for us is that, or at least my job, right, is to try to think about how do we make that data into something that really drives digital in the city. And I've sort of converted, there's a wonderful pyramid of data that's out there, and I put it into this chart because it sort of helps us to show how data on its own is actually not enough, right? A good data strategy has to facilitate good decision making, but what that really means is that you have to take data as an asset, the first thing, and you really have to iterate, you have to get that data to a place where it can become organizational wisdom, which means there's a lot of iterative processes. There's taking that data from data as an asset to information, contextualizing that information so that it can become knowledge, and then processing it in such a way that it can become organizational wisdom. If you're just looking for pieces of data to aggregate and thinking that that's going to give you an answer to whatever challenge you're facing, what we have found is that it's not enough. We have to be able to contextualize and really transform that data bite into something that's meaningful that then someone like a mayor can make a decision around. Similarly, when we think about transforming the public space or using data to drive the digital transformation of the public space, we have to recognize that part of the process that individuals go through is, that the resident goes through is, one, identifying the issue or the challenge that they care about. What is the pain point for them as a citizen? and then thinking about, one, how to access the information, the data that we provide through our open data programs, which I'll talk about more. But then two, actually act upon that information, right? Do something with the data that we provide, organize around the information, and then really share that, whether it be with other citizens or share it back up to their elected officials so that pain point becomes an actionable recommendation that is coming from our citizens into our elected process as part of the decision making, as part of the governance of a city. So in both of these cases, we're really trying to think about how the city uses data to drive organizational wisdom, but also how citizens can use data to drive impact in their community from their own vantage point. So how do we do this? The first thing, obviously, is we really envision ourselves as the city as a platform, and open data really becomes sort of the starting point. It's not the end all. So in Los Angeles, our open data program really started with the vision of our mayor that we could become that digital, that data-driven city, and that open data would be the launching pad for that. And we started through an executive directive. And so there's different ways of going about it, but for us, what was really critical was for the executive to be able to, in a way, say to everybody, this is not just important, but it's something that we're going to require that we all participate in, and it's something that we're going to consistently work on to improve. So we, very early on in our administration, we released Executive Directive 3 on open data. And again, the vision was to empower Angelenos to participate in governance, to promote innovation, because a lot of this data is meaningful to entrepreneurs and startups, to leverage our own asset, right, to make better use of the information that we had at our disposal, and really to foster creative thinking. One of the big hypotheses that we have is that the more that people use data, process data, analyze it, give it their own context and perspective, and share it, the more that others are able to leverage that one perspective and build on top of it. And that eventually will really solve problems by iterating upon each other's ideas of how a problem looks or how a problem should be solved. That no one person kind of has a solution, and that definitely the solution to our problems aren't going to come out of City Hall, right? It's actually going to come out of that co-creation process between government and citizens being responsive to one another. So we make data actionable through three types of approaches. One, we manage open data, right, and really leverage the release of information publicly to then, within the city, try to spread the use of analytics so that all of our departments are not just releasing the information, but thinking about how they themselves can use it, and use it in dynamic ways, not just simple analysis, but now getting more proactive, perhaps more predictive. And then also, how are we using the data to drive digital services? How does the data inform us about the kinds of services that we should be providing citizens? How does data tell us about the user experience when they come into our websites? And then how does the data inform the redesign of services, right? Like, as we're getting feedback from the citizen through our websites or through public engagement, how does that then get that back into the city so that we can redesign the way we deliver the service to be more effective and be more responsive? In essence, a lot of what we're doing, really, I always say, is setting the foundation for a smart city. I like to think that the smart city, there's lots of ways to think about smart cities, and how do you define what is a smart city. I like to use the one that focuses on being responsive. So we're trying to be a more responsive government, and we just feel like data and technology gives us the opportunity to try and get at that responsiveness. A little bit ahead of the curve, knowing when issues are emanating and being able to tackle them before it becomes a full-blown challenge within our community. So as a result of a lot of this work, we've been able to, in 3 years, actually build a lot of capacity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done. First, we have a series of portals. So in the 3 years since we've, I'm going to look at my slides before I lose before I lose track. We've been able to create several different portals that release public information. We have over 1,100 data sets that have now been released. All of them are machine readable. All of them have APIs that can be used by anybody across our city or across the world to drive their own applications or their own analysis. We've been ranked the #1 U.S. digital city in the U.S. Now for several years. We're the #1 open data city in the U.S. And what's been most important and key is we've been able to weave a lot of the information that at first in what we called Open Data 1.0, a lot of the information that was very static and just sort of uploaded onto a portal, we've been able to now start to develop new mechanisms for weaving the information more dynamically together from the source systems. So as was alluded to in the presentation or in the introduction, really now we're getting to a place where the first part of open data allowed us to think about what were some of the pain points in that process. So one of them was data not coming directly from source systems, so the data not being up to date because they were extracts. So getting to a place where we have a backend that's now connected to source systems where the data actually lives, and really creating really making sure that open data is part of the overall kind of business process, right? Because we shouldn't actually sit aside and create open data programs in a vacuum. They should be part of the natural workflow of the business day-to-day. And at some point in the day-to-day, what the employee or the person on the ground should be able to do is decipher what goes into open data and what goes into the internal kind of data management structure of the city. So what we were able to do in version 2.0, as we call it, of open data is, one, leverage the power of spatial, which we'll talk a bit more, but two, create a much more integrated system via our partnership with Esri in what we call the GeoHUB. So focusing on geospatial data, we were able to integrate the systems within the 41 departments across the city, be able to connect with our county, which is a different form of government in the U.S., and be able to pull in all of that data dynamically. And what we're then able to do now is actually push data two ways. One, into public open data consumption, and two, into a private space where city employees and departments can use permissions as a way to create groups and to share data amongst themselves, to analyze and visualize information internally before they decide what goes public, or just to use it for operational purposes. And three, to be able to develop web apps, and I'll show you a couple in a little bit, that actually make the data operational in our day-to-day, that make the city run and power in a more interactive way. So the power of location is really critical for us because what we came to understand really quickly after we launched the Open Data Program, and I think this is true for all of us, is that one, people really only care about what's happening on their street. For the most part, you can care about the general well-being of your community, but you really care about where you live. And we always say you might care about your block and you might care about your surrounding area a little bit more, but you're not going to care as much about the neighborhood that's like 4, 5, 10 miles away from you. And so the challenge for us is when we were looking at data in the aggregate or data in these kind of larger geographic units, we were really sort of missing the citizen experience on their street. So the power of location and the fact that technology allows us to give a lat long to every transaction is that now we can understand the citizen experience almost at their street segment level. And one of the things that we've been able to do with the GeoHUB is a lot of these transactions that were aggregated, we're not trying to assign a street segment to it and understand where do they live so that we can get to a place where on every single street I can really understand what's going on in that street, what the economic activity is in that street, what the criminal activity is on that street, what are the different transactions, calls for 911 or health emergencies, what are the demographics. And that, again, allows us to be a much more responsive, proactive city. So some of the highlights of what we've been able to do, our program started, our first open data portal actually launched in 2014. So we're actually celebrating the anniversary on the 31st, so 3 years. In 3 years, we did sort of version 1.0. We learned, we did the GeoHUB version 2.0, and now we're actually focusing on developing more applications that again, put that data to work. The first highlight was our Clean Streets program, which actually came out of, and time's running out, came out of a little bit of a crisis, a public relations crisis, in that a lot of the data that was being processed and pushed out, we found one, was not accurate, but two, was showing disparities in service. And obviously, in a city that's very large and very diverse, it's our commitment to make sure that we are servicing every citizen in the same way. So we went about addressing this issue through a very data-driven approach, which is for every street segment in the street of Los Angeles, we now have teams that will provide a score. So when you get to your street, you can now see, one, all of the incidences, and the score is made up of several categories, like bulky items, so sort of the big boxes, mattresses people would throw out on the street, illegal dumping, loose litter, which is just anything on the floor, and weeds, people who like overgrow their weeds. So we actually now, for every street segment, there's over 22,000 miles in the city, we will give every street segment a score based off of this, off of these indicators. And then for every area, we're now aggregating all of those street scores individually up into grids. And what you're seeing right now is the positive story, which is in 1 year alone, we were able to improve the cleanliness of the streets of 80% of our grids. So we went from a mild yellow, red map to now a very, very green map just by being much more actionable and understanding exactly what was the condition of streets and what kinds of resources we needed to layer on top of basic services so that we could tackle this issue. The same thing we're trying to do with public safety. So we track crime. Crime is one of those data sets that most cities in America tend to release. But one of the things we wanted to do is understand trends, again, at that street segment, at that hyper-local level. And once we started to understand the trends, the idea is, well, what are we going to use this for? So we started to think about, well, how do we plan and evaluate? So if we have crime and we're investing in programs to to reduce gang involvement and help youth develop and take on better opportunities and choices. One of the things we have to do is actually marry the crime data with understanding who is it that we're trying to connect with and trying to divert into positive opportunities. And so we've been able to create, this is just emerging, so we haven't actually done the evaluation part, but we're now using a lot of the crime data to think about where the planning of these programs are, and then we're marrying the crime data with the demographic data of the youth that we're trying to connect with. So in this case, mostly males between 10 and 25, low educational attainment, high poverty, and trying to then zero in on where we should be placing programs. Afterwards, we'll be able to, because we've married all of this data together, be able to note, are those same males 10 to 25, one, seeing a positive involvement in different activities, and two, are we seeing a decrease in crime? That's our goal. Those are the kinds of things that we can start to do when we start to marry all of this data together and when we get data to a very granular kind of hyper-local level. On the area of water and sustainability, similar concept. We have municipal buildings across the city that we've started out with. In Los Angeles, like Madrid, we actually have a very dry climate. And we've been in a drought for at least 5 years of an official drought, and actually California's been in a drought for much longer. So water conservation and energy conservation is critical to us. So the city has passed an ordinance to monitor our water and energy usage, and now we know by every building in the city the water and energy use and are able to track year by year and create a benchmarking tool that actually lets us know and lets the individual operators of those buildings, the city employees who manage them, how they're performing, how their building is consuming water or energy and how it's doing over time, so that hopefully we can drive improvements in the actual infrastructure of our sites and be able to prioritize as a city how we invest in which buildings and what the outcomes are in terms of savings. Time is running out. There's tons of applications we've been able to build. The key is that once you have the system and once you have all of the data in a place where you can manipulate it, the application development becomes much easier. And one of the key cultural shifts that we've made is we've focused on quick win applications, right? The point is not to create a complete turnaround from 0 to 100, but it's really to show the city employees, one, your data matters. Two, it matters because it helps you do your job better, and we work with them to identify what that better looks like. And three, we can do it quickly. If it was going to take a year or 2 years for us to set up the system, people lose faith. All kinds of things happen. Energy, momentum is lost. So for us, it's really about 3 to 6 month sprints, working to drive results, and creating these really beautiful, easy to use applications that show them this is worth it. So I'll leave you with a couple insights and lessons. The first one being that data alone is not useful. It requires meaning and insights, and we have to contextualize all of this information. There's got to be investment in thinking about how do you bring different kinds of data sets together, how do you curate that and cultivate and ensure that the data that you're bringing out can actually be used in innovative and multidisciplinary ways. Two, that collaboration leads to innovation. So the idea that I always say, we're not going to solve crime, but looking at crime data, right? You're going to solve crime by looking at built environment. You're going to solve it by looking at demographics, economic trends. And so the same way that we think about it that way, you have to bring in multiple data sets and multiple perspectives into one view to try and tackle any one issue. And that type of collaboration is what ultimately will lead to innovation, because I firmly believe that it's the different perspectives that actually gives us more of an interesting insight as to what's driving some of these issues. And then lastly, that greater public engagement and transparency is actually critical. Again, for context and for innovation, the citizens are the ones who actually know what's going on in their street. They understand why that corner on the north side, not the south side, is the one that you shouldn't walk around at certain parts of the time of day, or et cetera. So you need to be able to engage them in a conversation with the data about what's going on in their community, and they should be part of the feedback process. It shouldn't just be government telling them what the issue is in their community and how we're going to solve it. And that kind of transparency empowers and creates a sense of ownership in the community that actually does drive results, and I think there's been examples of that over time. Lastly, I'll leave with our future vision of the city is kind of an internet of LA things, I call it. Really thinking about how public data, our public sector data, blends with the private sector data and all of the sensors that we all have. And how do we create a platform or an environment that blends all those things together so that, again, we can create applications on top of that, have better analytics, more targeted messaging, and really transform the internet or the internet of things in our city into not just into connecting people to that internet, but really into more of a context awareness service type of tool. Right now, it's we see that the potential to actually serve and to drive the city's digital experience much more powerful if we can figure out how to blend all these things together. And we don't forget the importance of data ownership and privacy. So it's definitely something that as we are testing these tools, we're always putting the citizen at the forefront and making sure that they have, one, awareness, data literacy, and the ability to opt out and say, no, I don't want my information shared in this way. So with that, that's sort of how we're driving digital transformation in LA, and I think we may not have time for questions or time for questions. I don't know. I think we're done. All right. Oh, do we? Yeah, so I guess we do have time for questions. I don't know. Oh. So any questions? Nope. Okay. That's it. Thank you.